Lords of the Fallen 2023 is the best non-FromSoftware Soulslike that I've ever played, and it will probably be my personal game of the year. And while I imagine the actual Game of the Year awards will be fought between Zelda, Baldur's Gate 3 and Armored Core 6, for those like me who want a game that recaptures that Dark Souls 1 magic, an interconnected world in a fantasy setting with challenging combat and many builds, this game really hits the spot. This is my bread and butter, man. This is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Creating a character, being given a mission by a faction that may or may not be misleading me, and running around with a sword and shield, being killed again and again while getting lost in its labyrinthian map design. This is my vice, and Lords of the Fallen caters to it perfectly. For the sake of transparency, I did pay for this game at full price on PS5 at launch. I was given a PC code by the developers, but my PC is just too low end for 2023, and so I did buy the game on launch. If you had told me at the beginning of this year that I would be declaring Lords of the Fallen as my likely game of the year, I would have scoffed. I was very cynical about this game, to say the least. Looking at early trailers and marketing, I was very skeptical, thinking the game would be a generic combination of all these Souls games, but with no soul. I've now put about 50 hours into the game, on my second playthrough, and cannot get enough. Any moment of free time that I have, I'm firing up my PS5 and jumping back into Mournstead. The story, the lore, the exploration, the visual, the ambition, and the passion is so evident in this game. So if that's all true, why are there such mixed reviews for this game? Well, it mainly centres around some performance issues and the implementation of the co-op and why people were disappointed with it. I just want to acknowledge those problems now, and we will talk about them at the end of the video. But I'm talking about my personal experience with the game, and I wasn't affected by either of these issues. And at the end of the day, all I can really comment on is my personal experience with the game, which was tremendous. I want games that are made by people who care, who want to make a good product and are creative and passionate. And this is present not only in the game itself, but also present in the behaviour of the devs, who I was lucky enough to meet back in July, and I was seriously impressed about how much these developers clearly care about this end product. I say that it's my likely game of the year because I haven't gotten around to playing Lies of P, Baldur's Gate 3 or Blasphemous 2 yet, all of which would be capable of taking this top spot. But Lords of the Fallen falls into that specific category of game that is my favourite game, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. Something that recaptures that Dark Souls 1 magic specifically. And this game is the closest to try and capture that. And this video really is just an excuse for me to gush about this fantastic game. But before we go any further, if you like Souls-like games and you like lore, then please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, as my channel mainly covers the lore of these types of games, and this one will be no different. The main appeal of the game is of course the world, gothic and dark, harrowing and beautiful in equal measure. I think even the most ardent hater of this game could agree that the art team have absolutely smashed it out of the park. There is almost a granular attention to detail in this game to make sure that the lore matches up with the gameplay, and this extends to the smallest of things. For example, should you choose to use radiance, i.e. miracles, you will notice that your character cuts their hand as they cast. And this is because the god of light, Aureus, is a god that encourages penance, hence the penitent helms of his followers, and the thorns that adorn their armour and weapons. The attention to detail here, that your character cuts himself to summon the power of Aureus, is just an indicator of the care put into every single aspect of the game and its setting, and that of course extends to the environment and level design as well. And this is why Mournstead is such an amazing place to explore, from the ruined glory of Bramis Castle to the oppressive darkness of the Umbral realms, and the claustrophobic tunnels of Revelation Depths. But before we explore the beauty of Mournstead any further, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, HelloFresh. The best thing about HelloFresh is the convenience. HelloFresh does all the shopping and meal planning for you. Everything is pre-proportioned and comes with easy to follow recipe cards. HelloFresh is a product that I use myself, and I love how easy it has made my mealtime. As a content creator, I spend the vast majority of my time at my desk. Thankfully, HelloFresh keeps me healthy with quick and easy recipes, including their 15-minute meal kits, less time than a takeaway, meaning I get back to my PC as soon as possible. And as we move into winter, HelloFresh Market is rustling up some seasonal treats, with desserts like the apple cider cake with caramel sauce, or the mini pumpkin cheesecake. So if you're interested in making your life easier and healthier, use my link or go to hellofresh.com and use my code POGSMOOCT16 to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. Offers for new subscriptions only. Varies by plan across 9 boxes. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. The beauty of Lords of the Fallen is even evident from the first area of the game, the abandoned Red Copse village. The volumetric lighting in this area is incredible. In Axiom, the land of the living, you get a haunting red light passing through the trees, cast by the corrupted beacon in the distance. And in Umbral, this is replaced by a ghostly purple light which also passes through the tree. It's impressive volumetric lighting. Soon after you will make it to Pilgrim's Perch, an area high up on the cliffs, drenched in torrential rain. It's just very atmospheric. Each area is clearly handcrafted to tell a story, and unlike in other Souls-likes which try to imitate Dark Souls' opaque story without providing substance of its own, Lords of the Fallen has a well-written and thought-out lore, and this is reflected in the environmental storytelling, which is really well done. One needs only look at the art book to see how well conceived and thought out these areas are, and how they're each trying to tell their own story. Again, just reiterating the fact that the art direction in this game is definitely one of its strongest points. Vistas have always been a massive thing for me in these games, and it was one of the things that made me fall in love with the first Dark Souls. Looking up at Anor Londo from the Undead Burg, or the endless horizon found in the stunning Ash Lake. Lords of the Fallen also delivers in this regard, especially when you consider the 5 beacons of light which are your main objectives. These are scattered throughout the world in locations that you visit. It is so satisfying looking into the skyline and working out where you are relative to these other locations. What's more is that if you cleanse these beacons, they change from red to a pure white, and this is also reflected in the skybox. So if you've cleansed 3 out of the 5 beacons, you can look up to the sky and see 3 white beacons and 2 red. It's just a really nice touch that makes you feel like you are impacting upon the world, that you're actually changing something with your actions. The skyboxes and vistas get even more interesting when you switch into the Umbral realm, where you can see massive Umbral titans dominating the skyline and wrapping themselves around buildings. It feels really alien and cosmic. It's fantastic and highly immersive. For example, if you look at this vista where I'm in the Umbral realm, you can see these massive Umbral titans reaching up to this eye that's replaced the moon in the sky. But also below them you can see the beacon down in Forsaken Fen, the first area, the first beacon that you'll reach. And so it's really great to feel like you're part of this huge world, and was something I always really appreciated about these Souls games. What's more is that unlike Dark Souls 2, where the world felt impossible or dreamlike, where the connections between different biomes felt unnatural, the World of Mournstead does not have this issue despite all the different biomes. It feels real and naturally connected. You come to a poison swamp, a frozen peak, and a lava-filled castle, all within the same country, and yet none of it feels ludicrous. The team has done a great job in making this interconnected world feel both diverse but real, and it is definitely one of the strongest points of the game. As Fighting Cowboy said in his review as well, I think this is the best interconnected world we've seen in a Souls-like since Dark Souls 1, and that is a massive achievement. There are vestiges, this game's bonfires, and while they might feel far and few between, usually 1 per level, it is well complemented by the game's other systems. Because of the Umbral system, you do have a second life like in Sekiro, but there's also backtracking shortcuts and the Vestige Seed system. Vestige Seeds are items that allow you to spawn your own bonfire at a seedbed, and there are plenty of these seedbeds found throughout the level, and these are really great anchor points if used well to explore the greater depths of these huge levels. I have seen people complain about the lack of seeds, and I totally understand. You get them as a guaranteed drop from each boss, and you can also buy them for a high price at one of the vendors. However, for me, who spent a lot of time in the Umbral realm trying to explore everything, there are some elite Umbral enemies, the Moths, the Bringers of Stillness, and the Visages, that all drop Vestige Seeds as well, and in quite high numbers. I'd say it's basically a 50-50 every time I kill a Moth, whether I'll get a Vestige Seed or not. And so I had plenty on my playthrough, and they are great tools for exploring levels more completely. The feeling of exploration in this game is like that of Dark Souls 1, and it's this sort of untangible feeling, but you'll know what I mean. These are sprawling, well thought out levels that loop back and have shortcuts that feel massive and maze-like when you first play them, but by the end you have a real appreciation for how well intricately crafted they are. There are hidden items to be found and obscure NPC quests to be solved, and by the end you feel accomplished and immersed in this complex interconnected world, where fast travel is a convenience but not a necessity. This is all enhanced by the Umbral system, the two-world mechanic. There are two worlds in the World of Mournstead: the Axiom realm, the realm of the living, the basic map, and the Umbral realm, the realm of the dead. This is activated upon death, or by you going into it on purpose by using your lamp. Again, initially when I heard about this, I was very skeptical of it, imagining it would just be a gimmick, skin deep, but it is so well integrated. It is not a gimmick, it is part of the game's core identity and structure. Sometimes it is required to use to traverse a puzzle. Sometimes it can be used to find an entirely new area and loot, not present in Axiom. And sometimes it is just a second life in a boss fight. You will need to explore the Umbral realm to get some important items, especially the upgrade materials for your lamp and your healing items, both of which can only be found as loot in Umbral. Sometimes you don't even need to fully transition into the Umbral realm to interact with it. You can simply raise your lamp and peer into this second realm, and this can give you a glimpse into this other realm, showing you if there's any important loot or some additional routes that are only available in this second realm. Sometimes you will notice that an enemy has a blue modifier next to their health bar or a shield that covers all their health. This means they have an Umbral parasite attached to them, which could make them immortal or have health regen. If you are in Axiom, you won't be able to see these with the naked eye, and you'll have to risk raising your lamp in the heat of combat to find and eliminate them. But be warned, as you look into the abyss, it may look back into you. Because while you're raising the Umbral lamp and peering into it, you're actually vulnerable to Umbral enemies, and if they hit you, then you will be pulled permanently into the Umbral realm, catching you off guard, and being potentially surrounded by a mob of previously unseen enemies. It creates this sort of sandbox, where no two players' experiences will be the same, due to how much you interact with the Umbral realm. To give an example of this sort of sandbox and the discoveries you can make, there is a move that you can use with your lamp called Soul Flay. This uses up one of your charges that you can refill by draining enemies, but in essence the Soul Flay pulls the soul out of an enemy so that you can attack the soul while the enemy is immobilized. The hits you do while the enemy is flayed don't do direct damage, rather wither damage, and this means that if you hit them with anything when they go back to their normal state, it will immediately do all of that wither damage as true damage. However, there's a certain boss called a Mendacious Visage, and it's a very tricky Umbral only enemy, a sort of mini boss. It's basically a big giant stone face. If you hit it in the front, your weapons will bounce uselessly off it, so you have to attack it in its soft points, which are either at its back, or when it opens its face and reveals its true form. Now you can force these doors open that make up its face by using Soul Flay, and this is what I usually did so I can open it up for damage. However, one time I did mistime it, as the enemy does periodically open its face by its own accord, and so I used the Soul Flay after it had done this, and I thought I had wasted one of my charges of my Soul Flay. However, instead I was rewarded with an instant stagger, and this was an accidental discovery. And now, because of this accident, I now keep my Soul Flay charges for when the Visage opens its face of its own accord so I can get that tasty free critical attack. In short, the Umbral realm is no gimmick, it is impactful and part of the game's core identity. And while the realm is very useful for exploration, it is also made to feel super dangerous. And this is a good thing because it feels significant when you choose to explore this realm. If you willingly choose to transfer into the Umbral realm, you are giving up one of your lives straight away, and opening yourself up to be attacked by all the Umbral enemies on top of the regular enemies that are present in Axiom as well. Die in a fight against a dangerous enemy? Well great, you get a second chance, but now you have to fight them again, but now surrounded by Umbral enemies as well. Can this feel frustrating sometimes? Absolutely, but it is also a meaningful gameplay mechanic that actually holds some weight. To add to its identity, the Umbral realm has its own set of unique enemies, and these are probably the most difficult and dangerous enemies in the game. Spend too long in the Umbral realm to the point where the meter in the top right builds up, and you will be chased by a fearsome red Grim Reaper, and it will chase you relentlessly over the map until you die. This is a horrifying place to be, and you feel this constant urge to return to the land of the living as soon as possible, and that is how it should feel, intruding on the realm of the dead, and I commend the team at Hexworks for making this Umbral realm as horrifying as it should be. When I played the game back in July, I enjoyed the core of the experience and the combat, but there were some issues. There was a lack of feedback in getting the perfect parry, the rolling and movement was overtuned and highly aggressive, and while the hits felt weighty, the sound effects were pretty weedy in comparison, meaning the feedback wasn't as satisfying. I am glad to say that in the full release of the game there has been massive improvement in all of these fronts, and I immediately noticed the difference upon playing the final game. The feedback for parries is now excellent. There is a loud noise and a flashing purple light when you hit a perfect parry. The sound effects have been vastly improved for all hits and movement, and the rolls have been somewhat toned down. They are still quite aggressive, but believe me when I say they were massive before, and so while the movement still feels a little floaty, the combat feels meaty and responsive. And to be honest, you do need quite an aggressive roll and good iframes given how many mobs you will be fighting in this game. And I think dodging and iframes in this game are very fair and very forgiving. And in general, I find the whole rhythm of combat from top to bottom to be very satisfying. Lords of the Fallen can be played like any other Souls game, where you block and dodge, and then hit back whenever there's an opening. However, Lords of the Fallen also has a stagger system, a trackable meter around the lock-on, and I am definitely in favour of stagger meters being visible in these games. Stagger is a massive part in Elden Ring, and while you can get a feel for it when you're experienced with the game, I do think it would have been improved had this been implemented as well in Elden Ring. Every hit in Lords of the Fallen damages the enemy's stagger meter, but parries, heavy attacks, and kicks do more. And when the bar is depleted, it doesn't automatically stagger the enemy, which is obviously why you need a stagger meter. To knock them into the stagger animation when the bar is depleted, you have to kick, parry, or charge heavy attack them. Once you do, this opens them up to a fatal attack. Parries work like Sekiro, where each parry is more like a deflect that damages the enemy posture, but doesn't stop the enemy in its tracks, unless it has broken the posture bar, of course. And I felt that this was the right design choice for the flow of combat. Whilst I liken it mostly to Dark Souls 1 in its exploration and bosses, the movement in combat is probably more like Mortal Shell, so it's a bit faster. And I found the best flow of combat in this game was not to treat it like Sekiro. Don't try and deflect every single hit, as this is ineffective as sometimes it takes a long time to break a posture bar and you're just slowing down your DPS by not being aggressive. I found it better to deflect the odd easy to predict attack, while always keeping on the attack myself to not only damage the enemy's health, but keep pressure on the posture bar, and taking deflects when I can get them. This creates a really nice back and forth flow in combat, and when you factor in the other elements of combat, spells, your lantern, ranged weapons, dual wielding, and status effects, it becomes quite complex, and it feels like a wonderful dance, back and forth of learning your enemy, keeping on the pressure, while exploiting easy to predict attacks with a parry. When this all comes together, when you understand the parry and you keep the pressure on, using all the tools available to you, the combat of Lords of the Fallen is so satisfying, and far more engaging and precise than I think some people give it credit for. Let's talk about builds, as there are tons of them, and it's one of the massive appeals of this game. Like Dark Souls 1, there is strength and agility, i.e. dex. Then there are 3 schools of magic: Infernal, Radiance, and Umbral. Radiance being this game's miracles, Infernal is akin to pyromancy, and Umbral is like Dark. Radiance and Infernal straight up have their own stats, whereas Umbral seems to be a balance of both stats. When it comes to spells, I've mainly used Infernal, as my second playthrough is a pure Infernal build, but when it comes to the literal mechanics of casting spells, I can tell you it feels great. I'm not a big caster in Soulslike, but I'm having such a good time using Infernal builds. It's easy to use in the heat of battle. There is no need to switch between weapons and talismans or have your talisman in one hand. Every build, every character, has its dedicated range slot. And so in this range slot for a spellcaster, you put your talisman, and then whether it be a crossbow or a talisman, you just have to pull left trigger to ready your ranged options. And you can equip up to 4 spells, key binding them to R1, R2, X and square for PS5. And it really is that simple. Using it in a boss fight instead of having to switch between your different weapons and just pulling up your ranged options is so fast and so convenient. You have a mana bar which is refillable using mana items, or resting or dying. Ranged weapons also work the same. There is no single use ammo, instead you just find an ammo type item and equip it. You then get a set use of them for each life, and when you run out you can either refill these by resting or dying, or by using a single use item. I really like this, and I vastly prefer it to having to buy 900 arrows from a merchant. Some of the spells are really impressive both in conception and utility. Aside from the basic fireballs for my pyromancer build, there is a spell where you summon 3 Rogar hounds that surround the targeted enemy and light them up with a steady stream of fire. Very useful against bosses and slower enemies. There's also a big fire hammer that you jump up and slam into the ground, and I've found this really useful when enemies kind of crowd me, rush me and mob me. And not only is it very stylish, but it makes you feel powerful and it's easy to use. Like I say, I haven't tried Umbral and Radiance much, but from what I've seen they are equally as inventive and powerful. There's an Umbral spell that calls down a rain of corpses. Infernal feels really strong and satisfying, and the upside is for this build, I'm not losing anything by fully investing into this stat. Because in Lords of the Fallen there are weapons that completely scale with Inferno, so I don't need to waste putting points into agility or strength, and it just feels great doing a pure Infernal build. The weapons feel great as well. On my current playthrough I'm dual wielding 2 Infernal weapons, a Raw Mangler axe and the Bloodlust sword. Both of these weapons inflict burning, so it builds up quite quickly, and as you would expect, this applies a damage over time effect, which can be pretty significant against bosses. But on top of that, the Bloodlust sword also applies bleed, and this behaves as it would in a Souls game where a meter builds up, and then it does a chunk of damage. So here I have a build that can do infernal damage over time with my weapons, inflict bleed, and has access to powerful pyromancies. It just feels great, and it's a massive contrast to my first playthrough build, which was a heavily armoured, unga bunga sword wielding maniac. To augment the weapons and spells you use, there is of course the expected Ring and Amulet system, which is basically a staple of RPGs at this point, each giving you a passive that you can fit into your build. But there's also rune socketing for your weapons, and Umbral Eyes can be socketed into your lamp, which gives new passives and abilities. Some of these are quite significant. One of my favourite Umbral Eyes is the one that gives you 8 seconds of invulnerability when you first switch into Umbral. And this is a massive boon in boss fights, giving you 8 seconds after your first death to even the score unhindered. This is only scratching the surface of the variety of builds that you could possibly make that combine all the elements of the games. This is what you want from a Souls game: variety and replayability, something Lords of the Fallen offers in spades. It's a small thing, but I also love the effort gone into the starting classes. Aesthetically, they are all just really cool, distinct and flavourful, and have a meaningful impact on the early part of the game. For example, on my current playthrough I am roleplaying a follower of Adir, the demonic god of this world. and so I started as a Pyrrhic cultist, someone draped in the flayed skin of humans, bearing a human hand as a talisman for fearsome Pyrrhic abilities. Just how cool does that sound? Best of all, you can unlock some even more awesome starting classes, and I won't spoil any more on how to get those, but my god they are so cool, both in equipment and in fashion. I know Remnant 2 did this as well, and I really hope that more Souls-like games include unlockable classes that are really cool, as it gives you something to look forward to and a sense of reward. Lords of the Fallen also delivers in another aspect that many of us who love the Souls games do: fashion. Not only are some of the armor sets in this game really cool looking, but you can also apply different colour sets to each armor piece individually through the tint system, and these palettes are just found throughout the game ready to pick up. It's a small thing, but very welcome for those of us who care about the fashion in these games. When discussing a Souls-like, we of course have to talk about the bosses. For Dark Souls, while the exploration and level design was the fundamental basic of the game, the bosses were the tentpoles that anchored the experience. Likewise, I find that the Lords of the Fallen bosses largely deliver on this expectation because of one word: fairness. I've heard people complaining that the bosses are too easy, and I would disagree. They aren't easy, they just aren't overtuned. For those who play these games all the time, like myself, they may appear easy, because they follow the most straightforward rules of this genre. They have well telegraphed attacks that you can roll through, block or parry, and then there will be an opening for you to attack. Again, in this regard, Lords of the Fallen is most like Dark Souls 1, where I'm sure many Souls veterans also see the bosses of that game as easy now. Many people complained about the state of Elden Ring, because a lot of the bosses to them felt unfair and overtuned. And while I personally didn't mind these changes because Elden Ring gave you the tools to compensate, people who didn't like this will certainly prefer Lords of the Fallen boss makeup. And in regards to this game, I would personally prefer that the bosses were fair than overtuned. I had a great time with all the bosses, even the couple of gimmick ones. I felt very satisfied coming out of them. We of course need to shout out the art team when it comes to the bosses. It's clear that spectacle was a huge consideration when designing these guys, and it's hard to argue against the result, right from the first boss Pieta, and the likes of the spurned progeny. The Light Reaper is probably aesthetically my favourite boss. He is after your lamp, and he attacks you at several points throughout the game, making him feel like your nemesis in a way that Margit sort of did in Elden Ring, and he just looks so awesome in his demonic armour, his cackle, and his giant dragon. There are also some mini-bosses dotted throughout the game that are essentially this game's way of introducing you to an elite enemy type that you'll be facing further in the level. And I think it's a great way for you to be forced to learn these difficult enemies' moveset, especially since you'll be fighting them in larger numbers further down the track. When it comes to the regular enemies, I think these are also great. Again, the art direction from the art team is incredible for each and every enemy. Looking at the concept art, you can see the team had a clear idea of the types of enemies they wanted to portray, and they're really grim and gritty, and I love it. When it comes to enemy variety, I think there's a decent level for the length of this game. For reference, my first playthrough took me about 30 hours. There are Umbral enemies only found in Umbral, and then there are Rogar enemy types, essentially demons, and then there are the Hallowed Sentinel type enemies and corrupted humans. If this game was longer, I would expect more enemy types, but for the length of game, it's completely fair in my eyes. The Umbral enemies are all unique, minus the zombie types, which are reskinned at various points in the game, just for basic mobs, basically. The Rogar and corrupted humans mainly have a unique roster, but they do have a couple of reskins. But overall, I think there is plenty here, and from an art direction perspective, they are fantastic. The Ruiner and Skintaker Rogar are particular favourites of mine. Just incredible reimaginings of the demonic Rogar as they were conceived in that original 2014 game. Often as a lore guy, the most important part of the game is the feel and story of the game, and Lords of the Fallen is very rich in this regard. There is a lot to be found here and a lot to love, and I will be doing dedicated lore videos on this game, so subscribe if you're interested in that. Lords of the Fallen is a soft reboot, wherein the game is set so far from the original game in time that it looks and feels different and can have its own identity, and you don't need to have played the first game to enjoy it. However, the original game is still canon, a fact betrayed by the fact we have elements of the first game still present here. The judges, Adir, Antanas' descendants, and of course Harkin, the player character of the first game. So Lords of the Fallen has the advantage of being able to do its own thing, which it has done, especially in terms of its darker, more gothic presentation and the lore of Umbral, but also has the advantage of building off the foundations of the 2014 game. I think these factors give Lords of the Fallen a really fascinating and well thought out lore, from the politics of the kingdom and the religious hallowed sentinels, to the cosmic elements represented by Adir, Aureus and Umbral, right down to the suffering of the regular people at the hands of the brutal Rogar and the corrupted hallowed sentinels. And it really is a dark game, and I'm an edgelord who loves a dark game. It's dark and gritty like Diablo 2 or Doom, but in a 3D Souls-like game, especially in areas like Calrith, a city that's been burned and plundered by the Rogar, where innocents have been butchered and reformed into grim effigies to the god Adir. This all really appeals to me, the demonic flavour, the darkness of the world, and the respect for the original game's lore. And it makes it rewarding to read those item descriptions, to listen to those NPC dialogues. There's a lot to learn about and examine. Add on to the fact that certain points of lore are hidden behind Inferno and Radiant stats, and it gets really intriguing. It gets 2 thumbs up for me in terms of themes, feeling, atmosphere and lore, and I cannot wait to dive into the lore with you guys. Of course, I need to mention the issues with the game, because while I personally didn't care that much about them, I don't want to disregard or minimise the problems that people have with the games. I think the main one, from what I can see on Steam, is the co-op not being quite as seamless as other people would like. I haven't played it on co-op, but yeah, that is very disappointing for those who wanted to play it with a friend full on, full through. And so while it hasn't impacted my experience at all, I do accept that that is not great for those who wanted to do that, and I really hope the team at Hexworks fix this, as I'm sure it would bring these people back into the game. There's also the issues with PvP, and this is in regards to the netcode or connection. The connections feel very hit or miss. When it works, and when it doesn't, yeah, it really doesn't. When it's not working, it is pretty bad. Opponents flying all over your screen, rubber banding, and then you just die because something else is happening on their screen compared to what's happening on yours. However, this does have great potential if it's fixed. The invasions that did work felt like chaotic fun, and reminded me of the classic Dark Souls. And if you want to see some really good footage and more honourable duels by someone who's a far more talented player than I would recommend Ouroboros videos, which I will link below. But I do hope the devs do try and fix this system, as there is a lot of fun to be had underneath the connection issues, and it's definitely worth salvaging. In general, there have been some performance issues on PC, and again, I don't want to minimise this at all. People have had legit issues, and again, I'm sorry for those people. For me on PS5, it barely impacted my playthrough at all, so my positive experience is definitely mitigated by that, and I acknowledge that. I only had a few crashes and a couple of frame drops here and there, and already on my second playthrough after several patches, it's far better performance-wise. So again, none of this was nearly large enough to impact my largely positive experience with this game. The only real issue I had that impacted my first playthrough is I did feel the mob density and enemy health was quite hard in the midpoint of the game. On my second playthrough, I know what I'm doing, I know what the game's about, so I haven't felt it as much at all. However, again, I'm an experienced Souls player, and I can't help but think that some players who are new to this genre, or even just new to this game after having not played a Souls-like for a while, will struggle unnecessarily, just due to some mob density overtuning, in my opinion. And even with this main issue that I had, I do think it's an easy possible fix. By toning down the inflated health of some enemies at areas of high density. When a lot of us first played a Souls game, Dark Souls 1 for me, I think we can all testify to the fact that that was also frustrating at points. Especially in the catacombs, where there are tons of skeletons that regenerate, while there are necromancers that fire fireballs at you. Of course, the difficulty of this area was offset by the fact that each skeleton and necromancer had relatively low health, and I think with some rebalancing of some enemies' health at certain points in the game, it would solve many of the issues that I and other players had with these encounters. Look, I will be the first to admit that I'm not the most critically minded person. I can't analyse the issues that games have as well as some other reviewers. When I play a game that I just like the feel of, I am absolutely prone to overlooking its flaws. Lords of the Fallen comes together for me, holistically, and so any issues that it does have, and there are issues, are simply incomparable to its strengths, in my opinion. But that's it, I wanted to acknowledge the issues that others have had and mention the one issue I had. For me, I just wanted to talk about my own personal experience. You'll have to decide for yourself whether this is a game you want to get into by looking at all the available reviews and taking all the information about your own systems and consoles. But for me, I had a fantastic time with this game and I absolutely loved it. I cannot stop thinking about it. For me, this is the best non-FromSoft Souls-like ever, capturing the magic of that Dark Souls 1 perfectly in terms of exploration and bosses. I've heard amazing things about Lies of P and I will play that as well, but in terms of aesthetic and setting, I am a fantasy guy, so Lords of the Fallen is obviously going to top out in that front. While it's like Dark Souls 1, Lords of the Fallen has also done a great job in creating its own unique identity, something I didn't think it would in the earlier parts of this year. In its gritty aesthetics, in its lore, in its Umbral 2-world system. I think the thing about it is this game is just full of heart, made by people who really care and want to make good games. I had the pleasure of meeting some of the team back in July, as I mentioned earlier, and there was a moment when I finally beat a mini-boss when I was trying out the game, and the creative director, Cesar Vertuso, came over and gave me a high five. I got to interview the man himself afterwards as well, and it essentially became a chat between two guys who just love lore and stories, and seeing this passion from Cesar about his project and the world that he and his team have built was so refreshing to me and infectious. And if you do want to see a transcript of my interview with Cesar, I will link it below. It's available free to everyone on my Patreon. And that's it, guys. This is a game that's full of heart, full of passion, and just captures that Souls-like magic, itches that scratch that so many of us have wanted since Dark Souls 1. It's not a recommendation, as I said before. You have to consider your own situation in regards to your PC systems or console and what you want to get out of the game. If you just want a single player experience, it's going to be harder to beat this if you're someone that loves Dark Souls and fantasy like I do. And that is why Lords of the Fallen will likely be my game of the year. But let me know your thoughts below, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate and I'll try and answer them as best I can. But until next time, guys, I hope I will see you in the burning fields of Mournstead. Take care and have a wonderful Umbral.